Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. In this episode we're looking at the Battle of the Coral Sea. But before we start, if you enjoy the show, why not become a patron with a small monthly contribution? By doing so you'll help me grow the show. If you go to patreon.com/WW2podcast, you'll see some of the things I'd like to achieve. Increase the size of my hosting package, create an app to make it easy for people to find and access the show. So if you enjoy the podcast and would like to help me make it better for everyone, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast or click on donate at ww2podcast.com. In January, I had an email from Bob Drury. If that name sounds familiar, it's because I chatted to Bob in episode 30, talking about Old 666. He wondered what I had planned for the 75th anniversary of the Battle of the Coral Sea. As it happens, I'd not actually thought about the Battle of the Coral Sea. Bob suggested that he and his writing partner of Lucky 666, Tom Calvin, come on the podcast and have a chat. Not only have they written about the exploits of Jay Zima and his B-17 crew flying in the Pacific, but also Halsey's Typhoon, which recounts how Admiral Halsey found his fleet of 170 ships in a massive typhoon in 1944. Chaps, thanks for joining me. So I guess we all know the day of infamy, the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 41. And from then the Imperial Japanese Navy had exploded across the Pacific. So where are we by mid-42? Bob?
By May of 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese onslaught across the Pacific, it's like algae floating on the Pacific. They control 1/8 of the Earth's surface, and of course that's including water. They've knocked MacArthur out of the Philippines. They've taken Fortress Singapore, the United Kingdom's Gibraltar of the East. They've occupied the Dutch East Indies for the oil. There was Pearl Harbor itself, of course. And things are not looking good. It was just a series of unmitigated disasters for the Allies. And the Japanese had been planning for this kind of war with a southern force that would get down to New Britain and Rabaul. And Rabaul was it was the new fortress of the East with Simpson Harbor, and the Japanese controlled it. And since 1938, their plan had been, once we reach this stage, we know we're going to be fighting the United States, of course. And what we want to do is we want to knock Australia out of the war. So they planned to do that in May of 1942 by sailing an invasion force of 5,500 troopers in troop ships, accompanied by a carrier group, the 500 miles from Rabaul, which was their Southwest Pacific Air Base, and taking the Allied air base at Port Moresby, which was on the southwest coast of New Guinea. Now, this was just the only toehold the Allies had outside of Australia, the Australian mainland, and of course further southeast New Zealand. And the purpose of this invasion was threefold. One, it would eliminate what the famous war correspondent John Lardner, Ring Lardner's son, called the needle in the Japanese flank. Without Port Moresby, U.S. bombers, they could not reach Rabaul. They needed Port Moresby to refuel when they took off from the Japanese mainland. So they'd knock out this little fly that was buzzing around their underbelly. Two, it would pave the way for the Imperial Empire's invasion of northern Australia, with Port Moresby as the jumping off point, because the Japanese strategists had figured they could sail an invasion force 500 miles, and Port Moresby was about 500 miles from northern Australia. Now, the Australian Prime Minister at the time, John Curtin, he was so certain that this would happen, that his country would be invaded, that he and his government had drawn up secret plans to cede the entire top half of the country to the Japanese, Queensland, the Northern Territory, as far south as Brisbane. And the third, and perhaps most important leg of this stool, was once the Japanese invaded Australia, they hoped to knock the United States out of the southwestern Pacific theater and maybe out of the war altogether. Of course, as you know, the Allies in the Pacific theater since Pearl Harbor, they just suffered a string of unmitigated disasters in the 6 months since the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. MacArthur had been driven from the Philippines, resulting, of course, in the subsequent horrific Bataan Death March. The Dutch East Indies were in Japanese hands. Great Britain's mighty fortress Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, that had fallen. And aside from a few morale-building pinpricks here and there, Jimmy Doolittle's surprise bombing raid on Tokyo in April, and Admiral Halsey had made some raids in Japanese holdings, but as I say, these were no more than pinpricks. As far back as 1938, the imperial strategic thinking had been, we take out Australia and the United States might have to abandon all its far-flung Pacific holdings and protectorates in order to concentrate its defense on Hawaii and the mainland. And in essence, they thought they might be able to knock the United States out of the war in the Pacific altogether. So that was the strategy behind the tactics of invading and capturing Port Martin. And by the way, at the same time, the Japanese were also planning a landing on the tiny island of Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon chain to further complete the metaphoric wall around Australia. But there was one factor that Tokyo had not counted on, and that was the United States and Australian cryptologists had broken the Japanese Navy's most secret code, JN-25 it was called. Or at least part of it they had broken. And Admiral Chester Nimitz, the U.S. Navy Supreme Commander of Pearl Harbor, he knew all about this coming invasion of Port Moresby, down to the date in early May. Now, Carl sees it. It's a big sea in the Pacific. It's 1.8 million square miles. I mean, that's bigger than India. It's almost the size of Australia itself. But there's only so many sea lanes they could take from Rabaul to Port Moresby. So Nimitz, he even had the date. May 6th, 1942, that was the invasion date. Believe it or not, when he informed MacArthur of the coming Japanese offensive, MacArthur by now was in Australia. MacArthur was such a publicity hound that he began hinting to his favorite newspapermen that something big was coming down the pike. And this so angered Admiral Ernest King, President Roosevelt's chief of naval operations, that King had to buttonhole the U.S. Army's chief of staff, George Marshall, in the War Department's corridors and tell him, in no uncertain terms, that MacArthur's got to shut up. I mean, loose lips will literally sink my ships. But the Japanese seem not to have picked up on MacArthur's hints. So anyway, back in the Pacific, unfortunately, Nimitz optimally would have preferred to send Admiral Halsey and his carrier group to take on the enemy flotilla sailing for Port Moresby. But Halsey was still too far north. He was too far away because he had just delivered the bombers that Doolittle used to raid Tokyo. So that left the job up to an American Rear Admiral named Jack Fletcher, who was quite the unlikely hero.
The Battle of Coral Sea was a chance for him to redeem himself. He had been in charge of a task force in December of 1941, and right after Pearl Harbor, he was ordered to get over to Wake Island, which had been, ever since Pearl Harbor, had been every day. There were bombardments by Japanese, and even the military and civilian personnel there had repelled a couple of Japanese invasion attempts, probably hand-to-hand combat, whatever they had to do. And so they said to Fletcher, okay, get your ships over there, and I guess either resupply them, take them off if you can, whatever you need to do. And he didn't get there in time. Wake Island surrendered before Fletcher could get there, and he was blamed by the people back in Washington because they thought he had dilly-dallied too long and he had stopped for refueling, and that he didn't appreciate the urgency of the situation. But Nimitz and his people, they recognized that Fletcher had been caught in a number of storms. He had to refuel. I mean, what good does it get you if you get to Wake Island in time, but you don't have enough fuel to get out? That wouldn't have done anybody any good. So Nimitz, they kept their faith in Fletcher, and it was rewarded later because when Fletcher was, he was basically it. The Nimitz had sent Halsey and his task force. They were the ones who basically were escorting, I guess you could say, Doolittle and his flyers, and it was from I think it was the Hornet, might have been the carrier that the Doolittle flyers left from. So he was not in position when they started to get word, as Bob mentioned. They were cracking some of that JN or JL-25 code that the Japanese had, and were aware also from observation planes something was going on in the Coral Sea. And there was, they immediately realized that what was vulnerable was Port Moresby, and if you hit Port Moresby, then you're right on the doorstep for the next jump over to Australia. And just as Bob explained, you take Australia out of the war, either because they get invaded or because they say, listen, we're just going to sit this one out, then the United States is really in a pickle, because it might have to either give up any of its strategies in the Pacific theater, other than to protect Pearl Harbor and the West Coast United States, or possibly even, it wasn't beyond the stretch of the imagination to think the United States might try to work out some kind of peace agreement with Japan, as a matter of survival, so it can continue the war in Europe. So when they realized that there was something going on, they really didn't have much choice other than Fletcher's task force. So Nimitz still had faith in him. Others who didn't, it didn't matter. There was nobody else. And so it was Fletcher that started the necessary maneuvers to get closer and closer, and set up observation planes, and he sort of realized that, which was a smart realization, is that he could not take on the Japanese naval force ship to ship. He was outgunned, outmanned, outshipped. So the only way that he could successfully, or have any chance of success against the Japanese, was he had to hope that his planes could at least fight the Japanese to some kind of standoff and try and stop any invasion plan. So that was, he didn't go into seeking. He didn't seek out the Japanese with any great hopes of, boy, this is going to be a smashing victory. I don't think victory was even in their thoughts. It was just that we've got to stop the Japanese, which up to that point, had been impossible. The Japanese every step of the way had been successful, so there wasn't. I'm sure they didn't go into this Coral Sea engagement with a huge amount of confidence that they had the upper hand on the Japanese.
Well, there's that curious thing as well. We're talking about, when we talk about carrier groups, Fletcher's carrier group has, I think, 50% of the U.S. carriers in the Pacific, and he has 2.
Right, they had 2. They had 2. That was 50% of the entire Pacific carrier force.
And against that, the Japanese have 3 carriers, albeit one a light carrier. I wondered if, from a doctrine point of view, if the Americans and the Japanese thought the same way about their carriers. I mean, I wondered if anything pre-war, or the Japanese have subsequently learnt, that allowed them to use their carriers more efficiently, to give them perhaps more confidence.
I will say this: the leader of the Japanese flotilla, Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, he knew, as Fletcher knew he was outgunned, and Inoue knew he could outgun Fletcher, and so the fact that this Fletcher's task force was on his tail, so to speak, this delighted him. He said, not only am I going to land troops at Port Moresby, but before I do so, I might take out half of the American carriers in the Pacific. The war might be over right here and now, and I will be the hero of Japan. But as it turns out, Fletcher would not fall into that trap. He would not get into a gun-to-gun, ship-to-ship fight, as Tom said. And he decided to make this an air-to-air fight. And oddly enough, the whole idea, now, of course, dreadnoughts were the World War I ship of choice for every country. Carriers didn't exist back then, or not big carriers. And so when you look at it in hindsight, of course, the first naval battle where enemy ships did not fire on each other was going to occur in World War II, because it was the first war that had these kind of ships. But at the time, it just shocked everybody that there was this giant naval battle and the ships never fired on each other. It was all done through the air. But there was one man, an American, who had foreseen that this was what was going to happen in future wars. Unfortunately, we locked him up.
Yeah, I have to get a plug in for Billy Mitchell, because many people probably don't. If they recognize the name at all, it's probably because they're familiar with a movie in the mid-'50s, The Court Martial of Billy Mitchell, that starred Gary Cooper. Mitchell was somebody who, he actually came from a privileged family. His father was a senator from Wisconsin, and he became, joined the Navy, and he was still in his 20s when he envisioned that air power was going to be the key to America's military success, or at least an extremely important part of it. And so he became a real advocate for air power. And he fought in World War I. He had seen combat in the war. He came back and he started to push for, we've got to build planes, we've got to build ships that could carry these planes. And, he was not somebody that was a politician, let's put it that way. He wasn't somebody that was going to finesse the top brass. And so he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because he was so strident in his opinions. What eventually happened was he got court-martialed in the small world department, I guess you could call it. I think there were either 12 or 14 senior officers on this tribunal that during his court-martial, and 12 judges. And the youngest was Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur would later say he regretted voting in favor of convicting Billy Mitchell, but he did go along at the time. I don't know if it was because he believed he was voting the right way or he just couldn't buck the senior officers. But Billy Mitchell was court-martialed. His punishment basically was he was offered an opportunity not offered an opportunity. He was told, we're going to put you basically on the shelf for 5 years and on half pay. And he chose to resign after that, and he lived out the rest of his life, which unfortunately was not a very long one. He was only 56 when he died, but he continued to make speeches and advocate for air power, and he died, unfortunately. It was I think it was 36 or something like that. So he never got to see the kind of the way that what he envisioned was coming true. They were building these air carriers. They were figuring out ways that you could take off and land planes from aircraft carriers. It's really too bad that he didn't live another few years to the Battle of the Coral Sea to see what his imagination conceived of was actually the first time in history that you had ships that did not directly engage each other in a naval battle, and he was definitely vindicated, but it was years after, about 16, 17 years after he had been court-martialed.
And just as an aside, Angus, the chief American Army officer, while MacArthur was still in the Philippines, General Brett was in charge of all American forces in Australia. And then when MacArthur fled the Philippines and landed in Australia, he was made supreme commander of that Southwest Pacific campaign. And General Brett thought he was going to get that job. That was not the beginning of the bad blood between the two. The beginning was Billy Mitchell had been a mentor of General Brett. And Brett never forgave MacArthur for voting to go through with the court-martial, or actually for voting to convict. It's a tale for another day. Brett or MacArthur, one of them had to go, and one of them did. But the entangling alliances of the mid-war years came and kind of reared their ugly head through Billy Mitchell, who had been dead now for 6 years. So, but that's just, I guess the whole Billy Mitchell thing was probably an aside, but Tom and I just found it so interesting that he had foreseen what was going to happen so far ahead of time.
Well, it's interesting as well that MacArthur then is on that court-martial, because I've always got the feeling that MacArthur, the idea of air power sort of eluded MacArthur, and it was only when Kenny came along and showed him how to do it that he realised the importance of air power. There's another aside for you.
You're absolutely right. I mean, at one point, and here's even further afield, at one point MacArthur wanted to incorporate the Marines. He wanted to disband the Marine Corps, and he wanted them as Army troops in Australia. And to this day, I know Marines who have not forgiven him for that.
So if we're looking at these two task forces in the Pacific in mid-42, obviously the Japanese have one more carrier than the Americans, but I wondered how evenly matched might they have been? Was there anything that helped swing it from sheer numbers or technology, maybe in the Americans' favour?
Well, they were pretty evenly matched, other than the Japanese just simply had more ships. I mean, each had two carriers, regular carriers. The Japanese, they had the one light carrier. They both had 9 cruisers. Japanese had a couple of more destroyers than the Americans did. But then you start getting into all these other ships, minesweepers, mine layers, submarine chasers, gunboats, oil tankers. I mean, and then you get down to where how many planes they had. The Americans had 128 planes on their carriers. The Japanese had 127. So it was really more a matter of there was just a little more quantity of Japanese. And at that particular time, something that some people might not think of is the Japanese were simply more experienced too. The Americans had been at war for less than 6 months. Well, let's say 6 months, but less than 6 months. And most of that experience had been getting defeated. so the Japanese had been at war since, I guess you could say, 37 or 38, when you consider the war against China and their increasing belligerence towards the Southeast Asian countries. And they had seen nothing but success. So you did have a relatively inexperienced American force going up against a seasoned, the pilots and officers on the ships for the Japanese who had seen war for years, and they were just better equipped and better equipped, not by a lot, but better experienced. And Fletcher's, as we pointed out, he didn't have a lot of experience. Nobody on the American admirals had a lot of experience as far as combat, and especially as far as throwing as many planes as they could at an opposing force.
There's a lot to be said for feeling invincible going into a battle, especially when, as Tom says, you're battle hardened. Those pilots, they had made mincemeat of the Chinese Air Force. So anything thrown into the air against them on the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies, in Burma, they were king of the hill. And they were treated as such back in Japan. I mean, bomber pilots and Zero pilots in particular were the princelings of Japan, and they were the inheritors of I'm having a senior moment. What are the ancient Japanese warriors?
Samurai.
Yes, they were the inheritors of the samurai tradition, and so they had every reason to expect, okay, we might be a little evenly matched in planes, but when it comes to experience, we are just invincible. You have to think, no American would ever admit it, but you have to think that the Americans had to have felt that way a little bit themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess if we look at the opening round is the Japanese occupation of Tulagi. How did that go?
Well, that was part of the encirclement of Australia. They took Tulagi rather easily. In fact, Tulagi was the step towards Guadalcanal. And once again figured, okay, once we have Port Moresby to the north, once we have Tulagi and Guadalcanal to the east, and we built, in fact, they built an airfield on Guadalcanal that could accommodate heavy bombers. And I think Tulagi, I might be mistaken, but I believe Tulagi was where they kept their fighters for fighter escort for their heavy bombers. And their heavy bombers were only 355 at Guadalcanal. Okay, now we're well within reach of Brisbane. Not only have we cut off the lifeline from the United States, but we might not even have to fight for Australia. They might not just give us the top half of the continent, they might give us the whole continent. At the time, I don't think people realized it. Tom, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but a lot more rode on this fight in the Coral Sea than I think anybody realized at the time.
I think that's true, especially when you consider that it was not a clear victory for either side. I mean, if it had been a clear victory, I mean, we might be jumping ahead a little bit because it was a 2-day battle in which the waves of planes just kept attacking each other's ships. And, the Japanese light carrier was badly damaged, and then on the American side, we lost the Lexington, and the Yorktown was damaged, and Japanese had other ships damaged. If the Japanese had won a clear-cut victory, then it probably would have been just one of several. I think it was more significant that the Japanese didn't win a clear-cut victory. The Americans did not either, but I think, yes, well, you're right. It was like afterwards they started to realize, hey, you know what? That was really, really, really important for the American side because we stopped it for the first time. The Japanese were thwarted. They had been successful in everything up to that point, any offensive maneuver that they took, and for once, it was like we slapped them on the nose and said, "No, you can't come any closer. No, you can't keep winning." And the other thing is, I think as people realized as time went on about Coral Sea, looking back on it, is the Japanese could not afford to lose any ships and planes as much as the Americans could. Not that, I know there's that John Ford movie, They Were Expendable. Not that anything on the American side was expendable. But the Japanese, it was a lot more difficult for them to replace what was lost. America was at full throttle as far as its manufacturing power was concerned. The Japanese just simply couldn't keep up with that manufacturing power. So if they lost a carrier, either it took a long time to replace it or it never got replaced. And if they lost, 50 planes, maybe they got 25 or 20, to replace them. But as we would see over time, so people would look back at the Coral Sea, that war of attrition that was going on in 42, 43, 44, was a very powerful way that the Japanese were sent to defeat.
And Angus, it was not only planes, it was pilots. Before the war and during their easy cakewalk victories, up until the Coral Sea, I could say, even though you couldn't call it a victory, but that was their first setback in a way. They had given their Navy pilots 600 hours of training, and they had given their Army pilots 500 hours of training. That's why these guys were so good. But when they started losing pilots, they could not replace the experienced pilots. And, for example, Tom mentioned thwarting the Japanese for the first time on the Coral Sea. Well, the big thwart, I'm not sure if that's a word or not, but the big thwart was, once word got back to the strategic thinkers, the imperial strategic thinkers, and they found out that they had lost 100 planes, it wouldn't have mattered. Now, the Americans lost 35 planes in the battle. But even if the Americans had lost 200 planes, that 100 planes, and more specifically those 100 pilots, meant so much to the Empire that they sent word to Admiral Inoue, we don't like the fact that you have no air cover left, or have so little air cover left, 20 planes or so. Turn around. We're recalling the invasion force. Those 550 troops that were supposed to take part in Moresby, now they're on their way steaming back to Rabaul. And that might be an underlying victory right there that no one kind of thought of at the time.
If we jump back and look at those two crucial days, the events of those two crucial days, and prior, the Japanese attack on Tulagi, the Americans kind of show their hand by then retaliating with carrier planes. So the Japanese are aware that the Americans and their carriers are there, and we get these days building up to the 7th and 8th, which is the battle itself, where they're trying to find one another, desperately trying to find one another. But the strange thing about these two crucial days, the 7th and 8th of May, 42, is there's almost seems to be a lack of, I was going to say, it's just luck. It seems to play out very much just who had more luck than the other. For example, the Americans let the Neosho go to get her out of the area, the fleet oiler. Then the Japanese find her, misreport her, send all their planes after them, which kind of uses up their planes for that day, attacking the oiler, believing they found a carrier. And it kind of goes on with this. I have a quote somewhere about Rear Admiral Hara, the Japanese commander, saying he felt he was so unlucky on the 7th, he felt like quitting the Navy. Admiral Duckworth says, without a doubt, the 7th of May was the Coral Sea was the most confusing battle area in history. I mean, the big problem is when you're almost freed of having to see one another to fight, the problem becomes finding one another.
It's kind of the nature of the beast, because we are talking about, as we've mentioned, the first battle, naval battle, in which the ships didn't directly engage each other. So it was like the growing pains of this kind of warfare, that you were depending on pilots, scout planes, reconnaissance planes, and fighter planes, who are trying to engage the enemy over thousands of square miles of ocean. So to some extent, yes, luck had to play a part, because it couldn't be done by design. Nowadays, of course, we have so much advanced in the way of technology and satellites in space and things like that. We can find anything that's out there in the ocean, presumably, or relatively compared to 1942. But back then, it was just the primitive nature of a new kind of warfare, and nobody had the answer about how to make it better or more efficient. It was just, well, get out there and see if you can find somebody.
Angus, you mentioned in Neosho, it sounds like a Japanese ship, but it was actually an American ship, the tanker, the oil tanker. And as a sidebar, a small sidebar, as a portent of things to come, a Japanese dive bomber was so shot up attacking the Neosho that he was going into his death spiral, and he aimed right for the oiler. But no one had really seen that before. I mean, it had been done. It had even been done in World War I. If you're going down, try to take something out. But this was, of course, no one knew it at the time. But once again, we're talking about that's one of the reasons the kamikazes came into being, because they were these kids who didn't know how to fly. And because all the Japanese experienced pilots at Midway, at the Coral Sea, had been taken out, And when I first read about that incident on the Neosho of the Americans watching this plane coming down and exploding on an oil tanker of all ships, it reminded me of we're entering a whole new age of warfare with this.
Yeah. And then I was just glancing at my notes. Not only you've got that kamikaze thing, you've got the fact the Americans actually seem to have radar, but then from reading it through, it didn't seem to be the clincher that one might have thought it would have been.
Well, at that point in the war, where the radar was extremely primitive, they would pick up flocks of birds or cloud formations, and they couldn't really distinguish many times between what might actually be attacking or approaching warplanes and what might be, seagulls. It was almost like radar was more bother than it was worth if it was having you go on wild goose chases.
Especially across vast tracts of ocean. I think the radar worked much better on the coast of the United Kingdom. They knew when and where planes would be, the direction from which they would be coming. Whereas you're talking about, as I said before, a sea the size of the Indian subcontinent. And it was, Tom mentioned, what a primitive, and plus, we didn't mention this, but we mentioned this in our last podcast. The Allied forces in this, especially in the Southwest Pacific, were just getting the dregs. So they were getting, whether it was ground crews, whether it was, they weren't getting any replacement planes, but they were getting the bad stuff. So the radar was not guaranteed to work as it might in the North Atlantic, where we were escorting convoys that were vital to not only the African, we're still in Africa now, but also to Vladivostok, to the eastern frontier. So this radar doesn't work so well. Let's send it to the Southwest Pacific, see if they can figure out how to use it. Incongruous cast of characters, both people and equipment, armaments, and somehow they made it work with baling wire and chewing gum, and the Japanese at this point, they were, light years is probably too much of an exaggeration, but they were ahead of us technology-wise. And as Tom has mentioned several times, their experience was just overwhelming.
Well, I was going to say this possibly shows when we get to the climactic clashes. Both fleets find each other more or less at the same time. They get their planes in the air, not dissimilar time, and both attacking planes again attack each other's fleets at more or less the same time. Yet the Japanese are more successful in their attacks. Is that fair to say?
I would say yes. When they didn't sink the Lexington, the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, that first day, but they damaged it so badly that it detonated the next day, and Yorktown
was beyond repair.
Yorktown was badly damaged also. So yes, I think it's fair to say that the Japanese, even though they lost more planes, they got the better. Tactically, they won the battle.
Because that's the other thing. It's notable how poor the Americans' torpedoes seem to perform, yet the Japanese seem to have success with their torpedoes. At this point, we're dive bombing ships, which somehow seems arcane in this day and age with cruise missiles and things. But they're dive bombing, no doubt, through heavy anti-aircraft fire, no doubt murderous. Yet the Japanese, the American torpedoes don't seem to do anything.
What we get to, it's beyond, the Battle of Coral Sea, but a big part of what in Lucky 666 we talk about, especially when the guy who replaced Brett, General George Kenney, came in, they started to work on a technique called skip bombing. And in general, what the American flyers had to do was just find ways to be more accurate with their bombing. There were many exaggerations in the early part of the war in the Pacific about, we sank this, we sank that, and we really didn't, because we'd missed. The accuracy just wasn't there. I don't know. It probably was a combination of inexperience and inferior equipment, inferior bombs, as Bob was saying before. The European theater was at the top of the list as far as getting the best equipment and other resources, and the Pacific came in a distant second. There's something called skip bombing, which they started to work on and perfecting. And once they got that down, once the pilots knew how to do that, which is pretty much what they would, what it sounds like, skipping bombs along the water at their target from a very low, you come in a lot lower than you had been before. That's another reason why the tide started to turn, because we were starting to be more accurate, cause a greater amount of damage. We were getting more bang for our buck, literally.
There was a big tactical schism in U.S. air power between the old school, let's call them, and they saw bombing from anywhere from 15 to 25,000 feet, cluster bombing, as the way to win the war. Whereas that may have worked in Europe, where the munitions factory wasn't moving and where the command and control center was not moving and where the aircraft factory was not moving. It did not work at all in the Pacific. And they were sending up squadrons of bombers, and they were recording maybe one hit out of 60 or 70. And dive bombers aside, and experience aside, this just wouldn't work on Japanese ship captains. Saw them coming, they would just start taking evasive maneuvers. And I think we, as Tom mentioned, skip bombing proponents, I'm not sure if they won the day, but enough of them became good skip bombers that later on, when we were attacking the Japanese supply ships coming down the slot to reinforce and resupply Guadalcanal, that's when skip bombing really came into its own. But by the time of the Battle of the Coral Sea, we've got either bombers dropping bombs from high above and they're not hitting anything, or we've got inexperienced dive bombers, because the fighter pilots are just up there to throw cover. And we've got inexperienced dive bombers, and they're not hitting much. They did sink the light carrier, whereas the Japanese have been doing this for 5, 6, 7 years now, and they have better equipment.
At the end of that sort of clash, both sides choose to withdraw. And on the face of it,
so the Americans didn't have much choice.
Well, but both planes, they managed to get all their planes down. It just that they didn't necessarily get all their carriers away. So the Japanese have one light carrier sunk and one severely damaged fleet carrier, the Shokaku, and she would spend 3 months being repaired in Japan. So they decide to withdraw as well. I mean, we have very much, looking at the numbers, well, the Japanese think they've sunk 2 American carriers, don't they? It was reported. So there's going to be this problem with reporting. So they believe they've got a tactical victory. And presumably some American planners must somewhere look at pieces of paper and go, we didn't do very well.
That was, I mean, as we said in the beginning, even though it was reported as a great triumph in newspapers across the United States, in Australia, and at Pearl Harbor, it was, aside from the psychological and morale lift, it was, okay, you know what? Let's go with the newspapers. Let's go with triumph, because we didn't win that one. But yes, in terms of old time win and lose scorekeeping, you got to say the Japanese. They won. Technically, in a 2-day period, they won that battle. Now, of course, in the big picture, they lost the battle. They didn't get to land their troops at Port Moresby. They had to turn tail with those troops and run back to Rabaul. It gave the Americans a sense of, wow, we could take these guys. They're not as invincible. They're not they're not the superior fighters that we've been led to believe over the last 6 months. I think that's what makes the Battle of the Coral Sea such an interesting story. It nowhere near as important as the Battle of Midway a month later, but it was the first one. It was the first one where we could actually step back and say, you know what? Maybe all is not lost. Because I can't stress to you enough how much it felt in the Southwest Pacific particularly that all was lost. And, let's just try to hold on to Hawaii, because they're going to take the rest. They've proven they can take the rest. They will take the rest. This is unstoppable. And all of a sudden, they were stopped.
Chances are that if the Japanese had been able to invade Port Moresby, they would have been successful. And it was only as the war went on that I think the Allies fully appreciated the value of Port Moresby. It really allowed us to send wave after wave of bombers over the next few years including our B-17 crew from Lucky 666, and so it was maybe not immediately fully appreciated how important it was that we did not lose Port Moresby. It only became more and more apparent as the war went on.
Yeah, and I guess the big thing out of the Coral Sea is it really allowed the advantage at Midway, which makes it the strategic victory.
There's a school of thought that once again, Admiral Nimitz, because of the cracked Japanese code, the JN-25, he knew he was going to be outgunned at Midway also. And there is a school of thought that he may not have gone head-to-head with the Japanese fleet. It was the home fleet. It was a big fleet. But for the lessons learned at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Because if we're just going ship to ship, plane to plane, the Japanese outnumbered us vastly at Midway, much more so than at the Battle of the Coral Sea. And Nimitz might not have taken that chance to step into the ring with them, if we want to continue the boxing analogy, if it had not been for the Battle of the Coral Sea. And, of course, the surprise of he knew right where Admiral Yamamoto's ships were going to be because they had broken just enough of this code. There was that also, but psychologically, Nimitz might not have taken the chance to meet them head on at Midway if it had not been for the results of the Battle of the Coral Sea.
Yeah, they'd have carriers down because they'd lost them or they're in for repair, and it was a surprise to the Japanese that the Yorktown turned up. And I think it's the Yorktown's. All right, said it's the Yorktown's planes that proved crucial in some of the attacks at Midway.
Well, along those lines, and later in the war too. I mean, Tom, I think you know better than me. Didn't they start calling the Japanese? Didn't they start calling the Lexington the ghost ship because we managed to get another Lexington out to the Pacific so quickly that the Japanese just didn't think we could build another aircraft carrier.
Yeah, they call it the Blue Ghost.
Blue Ghost.
And because remember, as Bob mentioned earlier, as far as in Japan, they were reporting that both our carriers had been sunk, the Yorktown as well as the Lexington. So, yes, it was a pleasant surprise, at least for the American side, that the Yorktown could show up later on. But in the Japanese case, where the Lexington definitely had been sunk, there was a new Lexington that was put into service. Originally it was built, it was going to be given another name, but, there was a real push in Washington to have it named after the brave Lexington that had been sunk. And even when the second Lexington came along, there were 2 or 3 times where the Japanese reported that it had been sunk. And then in the next engagement, there's a Lexington again. So it was like this ghost ship just kept reappearing, the ship that couldn't be sunk.
That's a good title for a book for you, The Ship That Couldn't Be Sunk.
Actually, there is a book out there called The Blue Ghost, isn't there?
Well, if there's one, we have a friend of ours, a fellow named Phil Keith, and he came out with a book a couple of years ago called Stay the Rising Sun, which is about the Lexington that was sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea. And I think he's been trying to get a publisher interested in doing a book on the second Lexington. He hasn't had any luck so far, but I think it would be a good story, and that would be a decent title, The Ship That Wouldn't Be Sunk.
You can only imagine. Hey, wait a minute. Didn't we put this down at the Battle of the Coral Sea? What the hell's it doing here?
Yeah.
I wonder how many other ships were produced, though, that disappeared during the war and then reappeared with the same name. Because the speed they were churning them out.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Obviously, it stands out, obviously, being a carrier, because there's not that many of them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
So there had to be, I don't know. I wouldn't even venture a guess. I don't know enough about that. Above my pay grade.
Well, I think we've got everything in. Bob, Tom, thank you. If you missed the episode looking at Medal of Honor winner Jay Zima and the longest dogfight in a B-17, have a listen. It's episode 30, Lucky 666. Bob and Tom's book telling the tale is Lucky 666, The Impossible Mission. You'll find it in the bookstore on the website, www.podcast.com. Next time, I'll be looking at the Red Cross during World War II with Gerald Steinacker. If you're sat listening on your computer, go to patreon.com/ww2podcast to become a patron right now. If you're not at your desk, you'll just have to try and remember the URL, patreon.com/ww2podcast. That wraps things up for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.